August 1945. The Nevada sun burned white against the sand, but Hiroshi Tanaka barely noticed the heat. In his trembling hands, a dull metal cup caught the sunlight, but it wasn't water inside. It was cold, fizzy, sweet. Coca-Cola. The first drop hit his tongue like lightning. It fizzed violently in his throat, so foreign, so artificial. It might have been some kind of chemical weapon. He blinked hard, unsure if it was real. Around him, other Japanese POWs stared blankly as American guards handed out paper-wrapped hamburgers and cardboard trays of golden fries. Tanaka didn't move, not when the hamburger hit the table, not when a soldier tossed a half-eaten one into a trash bin, not even when a second bottle of soda was casually uncapped and offered like it meant nothing. A few feet away, Sergeant Matsumoto whispered, "It's a trick." Others murmured agreements. Perhaps it was poisoned, or some kind of test. No one had ever imagined this. Weeks earlier, Tanaka had expected to be executed. He'd been captured during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, a humiliation beyond imagination. According to everything he'd been taught, he should have died before surrendering. Now, instead of death, he was sitting at a picnic table in Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, watching Coca-Cola drip down his fingers. No torture, no screaming guards, just the distant hum of an ice cream machine. Tanaka didn't know it yet, but this moment, this absurdly peaceful afternoon with sugar and grease in the air, would haunt him more deeply than any battlefield. It wasn't just defeat, it was the collapse of an entire worldview, delivered in a paper cup. Part 2. Before the sugar. What they were told about surrender. In 1942, Japan was not merely at war, it was engulfed in a spiritual crusade. The conflict across the Pacific wasn't framed as a conventional clash of nations, but as a sacred resistance against Western imperialism. Soldiers didn't just march with rifles, they carried the weight of centuries, the code of Bushido, the whispers of ancestral honor, and the unspoken command that surrender was worse than death. Inside this worldview, Hiroshi Tanaka had trained not to survive war, but to perish with dignity. His instructors didn't teach tactics for retreat, they taught rituals for suicide. Entire units practiced bayonet charges not to break enemy lines, but to die spectacularly. The message was clear: better a glorious death than a shameful life in enemy hands. And yet, by mid-1945, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers would find themselves as prisoners alive, confused, and utterly unprepared for what they would face. The myth of the soft enemy. The American soldier, in Japanese propaganda, was indulgent, weak-willed, dependent on machines and comfort. He craved pleasure more than honor, and that, commanders promised, would be his downfall. The Japanese would outsuffer him, outlast him, outdie him. But across the Pacific, a different war was unfolding, one that Japan was never truly prepared to fight. The United States was not just fighting with weapons, it was fighting with infrastructure. Automobiles gave way to tanks. Soda factories were redirected to military supply chains. The nation that had perfected the assembly line now turned that machine against its enemies. And behind every rifle was a logistics line that delivered food, medicine, and supplies with clockwork precision. A tale of two lunches. On the front lines, Japanese soldiers often fought on empty stomachs. Rations, when available, were rice balls, pickled plums, and dried fish wrapped in leaves. As resources thinned, some units were forced to forage or scavenge from corpses. Disease spread faster than ammunition. Basic tools were improvised from wood and scrap. Entire battalions shared a single rifle. Combat boots were luxuries. Meanwhile, American soldiers marched with K-rations containing chocolate, cheese, cigarettes, and instant coffee. They carried can openers and chewing gum into battle. They fought tired, but rarely hungry. This disparity only widened as the war dragged on. By 1944, U.S. factories were producing 96,000 aircraft per year. Japan could barely keep its existing fleets in the sky. While American battleships were powered by endless convoys of fuel, Japanese ships often sat idle, waiting for oil that never came. The material imbalance was staggering, but its psychological impact that came later, the arrival of the first POWs. After the Battle of Guadalcanal in late 1942, the first major wave of Japanese POWs entered American custody. The guards expected broken men, possibly rabid fanatics. What they got were elite troops, Marines, naval aviators, veterans of Pearl Harbor and Singapore, men who had once believed they were part of an unstoppable empire. They were processed through clean, organized facilities. Their wounds were treated by calm, uniformed medics. Their names were recorded and their diets scheduled. One such prisoner, Sergeant Yukio Matsumoto later wrote, "The bandages came in sterile packaging. The medicine had printed labels. Even the scissors were polished. It was like a hospital from a dream." In contrast, back home, Japanese military hospitals were crumbling. Field medics reused supplies until they disintegrated. Bandages were boiled and dried for reuse. There were no printed labels, just jars and guesswork. Cultural whiplash behind barbed wire. American prison camps were governed by the Geneva Conventions, but often exceeded those standards. Camp McCoy, Camp Shelby, Camp Livingston, each one operated like a miniature town. Barracks lined up in perfect rows. Paved roads crisscrossed the compounds. Electricity, running water, laundry services, recreation areas with soccer fields and movie nights. To the Japanese prisoners, this wasn't luxury, it was sorcery. Their camps back home, by contrast, were improvised and brutal. The concept of humane treatment for enemies was foreign, almost suspicious. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Hayashi, a naval officer shot down near the Marshall Islands, recounted in his memoir, "We thought the hamburger was a lie, that food like this couldn't be real, that maybe it was poisoned. But what shook me most was how casually the Americans gave it away, like it meant nothing. That casual abundance was the first crack in the wall." The American doctrine of overfeeding. There was logic behind the generosity. A well-fed prisoner doesn't rebel. A healthy one requires fewer resources. But more than that, the food itself became a weapon of ideology, a symbol of what America was and what Japan could never be under its current path. Canned meat, processed cheese, white bread softer than anything they'd ever seen, and of course, Coca-Cola. By 1943, the soda had become so integral to U.S. troop morale that bottling plants were set up near battle zones. It was nostalgia in a bottle, and now, it was being handed to former enemies. It didn't nourish, it didn't heal, it wasn't medicine or fuel, and yet it was everywhere, even in war. For a culture taught to treasure every grain of rice, a cold bottle of Coca-Cola was not refreshment, it was revelation. Cracks in the Bushido. Many prisoners were hesitant to eat. Some refused outright. They feared dishonor more than starvation. But hunger wears down ideology. Within days, they began tasting. Within weeks, they asked for second. The flavors were overwhelming: salty, oily, sweet. Fast food was alien to their palates, but comforting in a way they couldn't explain. And slowly, the truth began to sink in. This wasn't just America's cuisine, it was its philosophy. Feed more, waste more, move faster, live bigger. What had started as defeat by arms was becoming defeat by comparison. Part 3. The Taste of Defeat. When Flavor Broke the Sword. In the early spring of 1945, Captain Ichiro Sato, formerly of the 32nd Infantry Regiment of the Imperial Japanese Army, awoke not to a bugle, but to the faint hiss of carbonation. The noise was soft, almost imperceptible, but to a man trained in silence and suspicion, it pierced the fog of routine like a gunshot. He turned toward the mess tent, and there it was again, the psh of a Coca-Cola bottle being opened. That day, Camp Livingston in Louisiana had arranged a treat for the prisoners, a delivery truck bearing ice-cold bottles of the American soft drink. The truck itself was unremarkable, red, functional, with the company logo printed like a badge of victory. But to Sato, it might as well have been a war trophy. He stood among hundreds of prisoners as they received their bottles. Each label was identical, each cap perfectly sealed, the temperature exact, the presentation flawless, and the driver? Cheerful, efficient, dressed in corporate uniform, like a soldier of capitalism. Sato held his bottle for a long time. It sweated in the humid air. He hadn't opened it yet. Around him, others had already taken cautious sips. Some grimaced at the sweetness, others closed their eyes in pleasure. A few refused altogether. But Sato stared at the bottle as if it were a relic, and then he realized this wasn't just a drink, it was proof. Proof that the enemy could create abundance so effortlessly, not in factories behind the lines, but here, in the belly of wartime America. If they could spare this much attention on feeding us, what must they be giving their own troops, their own civilians? Food as revelation. Sato wasn't alone in his shock. Lieutenant Masao Fujiwara had been working in the camp kitchen for nearly a month. He had expected punishment, hard labor, or at best, silence. What he received was a job, a schedule, clean clothing, and access to one of the most astonishing things he had ever seen: the American military food logistics system. Each morning, refrigerated trucks rolled into the compound. Massive slabs of beef, Blocks of government cheese, the size of fuel canisters, industrial-sized cans of green beans, butter, flour, sugar, all arriving on time, all labeled, all organized. One afternoon, Fujiwara attempted to lift a single side of beef. It took 3 men. He joked half seriously that this one piece of meat could have fed his entire naval squadron for a week. The American kitchen staff laughed. They thought he was exaggerating. He wasn't. The machinery of satisfaction. The mess hall operated like a factory. Food prep followed schedules. Machines mixed dough and ground meat with mechanical precision. Ovens baked in bulk. Fryers hissed with predictable rhythm. There was no guesswork, no make-do, only systems. Fujiwara began to notice patterns. Certain meals repeated on a 14-day cycle. Ingredients rotated efficiently. Even waste was measured. But what struck him wasn't just the quantity, it was the standardization. Every hamburger looked the same. Every scoop of mashed potatoes fit a mold. Even the ketchup came in measured packets. This wasn't cooking, it was engineering. And yet, it worked. The meals were filling, flavorful, addictive even. Not because they were exquisite, but because they were designed to hit pleasure centers. Salt, fat, sugar, heat. The science of satisfaction had been industrialized. Fujiwara once wrote in his post-war journals, "We trained to kill with swords, they trained to feed with machines, and in the end, it was the latter that proved more powerful." Waste as a weapon. Perhaps the most incomprehensible experience for the prisoners was not what they were given, but what was thrown away. Half-eaten sandwiches in the trash, coffee poured down drains, napkins discarded without a second glance, empty Coca-Cola bottles tossed into bins by the dozens. To Japanese soldiers, this wasn't just shocking, it was almost immoral. Private Kenji Nakamura had grown up in Hiroshima. His family had rationed string, reused wrapping paper, repaired broken bowls. In training, he had been taught to survive with a pocket full of rice and a strip of dried kelp. Now, he watched American guards casually discard more food in a day than he had seen in weeks of active duty. At first, he assumed it was an illusion or some form of intimidation. But as the days passed, he realized it wasn't a show. It was simply how America operated. The guards who smiled. Over time, something unexpected began to happen. The guards changed. They no longer saw the prisoners as caricatures. They saw them as men, soldiers, humans. Corporal James Mitchell, a 19-year-old from Iowa, had lost an older brother in the Pacific. He had arrived at Camp McCoy angry, wary, and ready to retaliate in subtle ways. But then he saw their faces. He saw the prisoners fold paper napkins to take back to their bunks. He saw them line up silently for burgers. He watched one man hold an empty Coke bottle like it was crystal, and something shifted. In his letters home, Mitchell wrote, "They look like boys who'd been promised glory and given rice husks instead. One of them smiled when I gave him a spoon. A goddamn spoon." That smile haunted him more than any battlefield story. Tasta Revire's belief. The transition wasn't immediate, but it was irreversible. The prisoners who had once muttered about poison now lined up early for lunch. They asked for seconds. They debated over which meals were best. They began to crave, and not just food, but understanding. Captain Sato, after finally drinking his bottle of Coca-Cola, wrote this in his diary. "We trained to embrace death, but we were never taught how to process kindness. Not from an enemy. Not when it tasted like caramel and carbonated water." The realization was existential. If the enemy was capable of such production and such generosity, then what else had been a lie? Had they been fighting a myth? Was Japan's righteous sacrifice simply a failure to industrialize? The psychological bomb. As 1945 wore on, the tide of war was undeniable. American bombers roamed freely. Tokyo was burning. Rumors of a new weapon, something atomic, echoed through the camps. But for many prisoners, the real explosion had already happened. It wasn't the blast of a bomb. It was the shattering of certainty, of the idea that honor could defeat infrastructure, that loyalty could conquer logistics, that the emperor's will could stand against refrigeration and supply chains. Lieutenant Hayashi, who had resisted American meals for weeks, eventually confessed to a fellow prisoner. "I believed I was strong because I could endure hunger, but now I wonder perhaps real strength lies in building a world where no one needs to." Part 4. A system that fed on efficiency. The hamburgers were not the point, nor were the fries or the Coca-Cola. These were symptoms, surface-level expressions of something deeper, larger, and far more decisive. To truly understand why a soft drink could destabilize a belief system, we must pull back and see the full scale of the machine behind it. This was not just a war between nations, it was a war between systems. One was built on scarcity, ritual, and sacrifice. the other on abundance, engineering, and logistical precision. And in the end, only one system could survive a global war. The numbers behind the bun. By 1945, the United States was producing over 200 million pounds of canned meat per year, not just for soldiers, but for prisoners, allies, even civilians. American factories had become the lungs of the Allied war effort, breathing out an uninterrupted stream of processed nutrition, standardized packaging, and caloric reliability. This abundance wasn't accidental. It was by design. Henry Ford's assembly line had found its final form not in Detroit, but in the military supply chain. The same principles that once produced automobiles now manufactured survival at scale. From weapons to uniforms, from bandages to biscuits, everything was broken down into steps, optimized, and replicated across the continent. A hamburger in a prison camp wasn't just a meal. It was a demonstration of industrial ideology. The Food Logistics Network. Each U.S. military camp, even domestic POW camps, was connected to a vast infrastructure web. Warehouses in Chicago stored canned goods for months in advance. Refrigerated rail cars moved dairy and meat across thousands of miles. Standardized kitchens in each camp followed detailed preparation manuals. Menus were rotated to ensure variation and morale. Even waste was tracked. Even trash was quantified. Lieutenant Fujiwara once noted in his kitchen records that the camp discarded 3 times more food packaging daily than what our units had for combat rations in Burma. To the Japanese mindset, shaped by frugality and improvisation, this was not only unthinkable, it was psychologically destabilizing. It exposed an uncomfortable truth. Japan was not losing because it fought poorly. It was losing because it couldn't feed. The soft power of soft drinks. Why was Coca-Cola present in so many bases, even war zone? Because it wasn't just about taste. It was about symbolism. Coca-Cola had embedded itself into American military doctrine, not through orders, but through desire. Soldiers wanted it, officers requested it, morale officers approved it, logistics made it happen. By 1943, there were over 60 Coca-Cola bottling plants operating near U.S. military zones, many of them in combat theaters. The drink became part of standard supply, delivered with rations, fuel, and ammunition. It served no nutritional purpose, had no tactical value, and yet it arrived everywhere. That baffled Japanese prisoners. For a military force raised on efficiency and necessity, the idea of allocating industrial resources to a pleasure beverage was incomprehensible. Until, slowly, they realized, this isn't waste, it's control. They don't just manage war, they manage morale. From honor to metrics. Bushido, the ancient code of the warrior, taught that suffering elevated the soul, that self-denial was strength, that hunger could be conquered by will. But the American system didn't honor hunger. It eliminated it, not out of kindness, but because hunger reduced combat effectiveness. It delayed operations. It cost more in medicine and mutiny than in calories. And so the machine was built to predict, measure, and remove it. Every prisoner fed wasn't an act of generosity. It was a calculated stability mechanism. Healthy prisoners were less dangerous. Satisfied men didn't riot. Structured systems prevented chaos. Captain Sato, who once believed the enemy's softness would be their undoing, came to a different conclusion. We saw indulgence. What we missed was discipline in disguise. The American camp as a microcosm. Take a single prison camp in 1945, let's say Camp McCoy. Population, 0 prisoners. Staff, to 300 American personnel. Meals per day, SIS 0. Electricity consumption, comparable to a small town. Daily deliveries, meat, bread, coffee, soap, cigarettes, paper, oil. In a span of 24 hours, the camp processed 500 pounds of flour, 200 pounds of meat, 1,200 Coca-Cola bottles, 30-plus trash bins of waste. Now multiply that by dozens of camps across the U.S. Compare that to Japan's own military rationing system, where soldiers in the field shared a single fish among 5 men, and wounded personnel in hospitals reused bandages until they fell apart. The contrast wasn't merely physical, it was epistemological. One side treated war as a moral test, the other as a logistics problem. And logistics, it turned out, won. The collapse of a belief. By the time Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on the 15th of August 1945, many Japanese POWs had already surrendered internally. Not to force, but to reality. They had watched American guards casually pour out half-empty sodas while Tokyo burned. They had eaten daily, well, predictably, and in surplus, while news of starvation crept into letters from home. They had learned to use can openers, operate ice cream machines, fold American flags. They no longer recoiled from hamburgers. They craved them. But more than the food itself, they craved the stability behind it, the system, the order, the possibility that a society could be both efficient and indulgent without contradiction. From enemy to blueprint, what began as confusion had become admiration, not for the soldiers, not even for the ideology, but for the functioning. The system they had fought against had outproduced their sacrifice. It had outorganized their discipline. It had outfed their loyalty. And in doing so, it shattered a worldview, not by argument, but by demonstration. Part 5. When a hamburger replaced the flag. As the ships approached Japan's coast in late 1945, the returning prisoners stood in silence. They had left a nation built on sacrifice. They returned to a landscape scorched, cratered, hollowed by war. From the decks of American repatriation ships, many of them Liberty vessels built faster than Japan could sink them, they saw a civilization in ruins, both physically and philosophically. Tokyo was rubble. Harbors were clogged with twisted steel. The proud factories that once fueled the empire now looked like relics, not because they were destroyed, but because they had been outpaced by a different kind of power. And in their bags, many prisoners carried strange trophies: an empty Coca-Cola bottle, a stained hamburger wrapper, a tin spoon stamped US Army. To any outsider, these were trash. But to the men who had held them, they were artifacts of awakening, cultural ammunition. The first things to arrive in post-war Japan weren't tanks or generals. They were distribution models, food trucks, mass production, soft power. Coca-Cola opened bottling plants. McDonald's would soon follow. But even before that, the concept of feeding everyone the same thing, predictably, cheaply, efficiently, that took root like an invasive species. Former prisoners, men once broken by fast food and abundance, became messengers. They told stories. They described the kitchens, the systems, the waste, the power behind simplicity. They became consultants, businessmen, bureaucrats. Some even became diplomats, bridging the gap between two former enemies, now learning to speak the same industrial language. A new kind of strength. In the decades that followed, Japan did not rebuild itself by returning to the Bushido Code. It rebuilt by adopting the very system it once scorned. Assembly lines, corporate logistics, consumer standardization, abundance as ideology. The rice bowl remained, but the hamburger arrived beside it. Coca-Cola was no longer a symbol of defeat. It was a soft drink at the corner store. And the irony? Japan, by the 1980 seconds, had become the very thing it had once failed to understand. A nation that fed millions, exported efficiency, and worshipped uniformity not through sacrifice, but through systems. The power of predictable pleasures. What those prisoners learned in the camps wasn't just about food. It was about the power of a society that removes friction, that simplifies, that delivers, that gives not just calories, but consistency. And when that becomes scalable, it becomes civilization. Private Suzuki, who once suspected poison in his hamburger, would later become a logistics consultant. In a rare interview, he said, "America didn't defeat us with bombs. They defeated us with system." The burger was just the flag we saw when we finally looked up. The true lesson of 1945. We often think wars are won with superior strategy or heroic sacrifice. But in the modern world, wars are won by who can outfeed, outsupply, and outsimplify the future. The Japanese prisoners didn't just lose a war. They lost a framework. They discovered that strength doesn't always scream. Sometimes it hisses from a bottle cap. Sometimes it smells like grease on a paper tray. Sometimes it's waste not out of excess, but because there's more where that came from. And you? We end with the image of Hiroshi Tanaka, the man who once shook while holding a metal cup, who once believed death was nobler than surrender. Now standing at Tokyo Bay, watching a ruined city emerge from the fog, he lifts a near-empty Coca-Cola bottle to his lips, a final sip, not of refreshment, but of realization. We had been fighting not a nation, he would later write, but a method, a different kind of future. One where survival wasn't earned through pain, but delivered in boxes, in trucks, in bottles, predictable, inevitable. If you had been there, if you were one of them, would you have resisted the hamburger or welcomed it? Was this a defeat or the beginning of a quiet revolution? What do you think?